Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, John and Lee proudly present the greatest wrestling show ever!
Right, guys, welcome to episode 14 of the greatest wrestling show ever. Now, before we continue, there's a bit of an elephant in the room that needs addressing. We've obviously not been on for the last couple of weeks with Christmas and everything else, going into lockdown, tier 3, tier 4 and all that. We've missed the last few weeks, and there's been a number of people asking where it's been, tweets, Facebook messages, emails. Now, it's going to be possible for you to guess the exact number of people we've had chasing up what's happened to the show, Lee, but just rounding off to the nearest 100, what do you reckon?
The nearest 100, I'd say 100.
I thought it's 0, I'm afraid, to the nearest 100. Yeah, good guess, but, So we're into the semi-main event, as they would say in America. It's from WrestleMania 13. It's Bret Hart versus Steve Austin, given 5 stars out of 5 star by Dave Meltzer at the time. So we've gone to the WrestleMania 13 pay-per-view. We've gone to start the chapter and skip back a couple of minutes to get the overview of the build-up to the match. So if anyone is listening alongside watching this, WrestleMania 13, we're 1 hour, 18 minutes and 44 seconds in. We're pressing play in 3, 2, 1, go. Right. So again, you weren't watching wrestling particularly at this point, were you?
No.
So do you know much about the build-up to this?
No. This is, when's this, 1997?
Yeah, early 97. So just to rewind a little bit, up until WrestleMania 12 in March 96, you'll probably know the basic gist. You know, Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels become the faces of the new generation, younger, smaller, better wrestlers, supposedly representing a new steroid-free future. They clash in the main event of WrestleMania 12 in an Iron Man match, which Shawn Michaels wins with a super kick in 2.5 minutes of extra time. Bret then goes on hiatus, again, as they pronounce it in America. He finishes off a few matches, I think, on a South African tour. But other than that, is out of contract, is uncommitted as to what he's going to do. And throughout mid to late 96, is part of a bidding war, essentially, between WCW, who are on fire at that point at the start of the NWO story, and WWF. Eventually, he chooses to sign for WWF for less money than WCW were offering him, partly out of loyalty to Vince and the promotion, but also they offer him a long-term contract. So it's a total of 20 years. If I remember correctly, it was something like 3 years as an active performer, maybe 7 years as like a TV character, and then 10 years in like an office role. So he was essentially set up for life. Signs the company, comes back, faces Steve Austin at Survivor Series 96 in a relatively unbuilt-up match, but a good one nonetheless. And as it's explaining in this storyline now, the WWF that Bret Hart comes back to is, at least in his interpretation, a very different one to the one he left. Gone is the black and white, simple good guys versus bad guys, where wholesome, I was about to say all-American, all-Canadian hero like him is cheered for his honesty and integrity.
Was he not offered more control as well to stay with WWF?
I don't think he necessarily was. I think he had written into his contract at the end, his final month, he had creative control, but that was potentially about protecting himself. Now, I don't know if that was written in when they agreed the release from the contract, or if it was written in right from the very start.
Yeah.
Got Ken Shamrock there. That's Ken Shamrock's first appearance in WWF. Just to sideline slightly, Ken Shamrock himself was the part of a bidding war at that point, essentially between New Japan Pro Wrestling, who had actually announced having signed him only a few weeks before, instead for WWF to swoop under their noses and sign him on $1 million a year contract, which at that time, again, was fairly unheard of. And this is Shamrock's first proper appearance as the special referee and enforcer for this submission match, because Ken Shamrock's background was in UFC. So in theory, if you've had a fight in a cage, you are qualified to referee a professional wrestling submission match. He was actually, believe it or not, Shamrock, a professional wrestler before he was a UFC fighter. He wrestled in the early 90s, I think in Carolina area, under the name, I think it was Vince Torelli, and is most famous at that point for getting a kicking in a hotel room from the Nasty Boys.
Oh wow, in real life.
Yeah. So I don't quite know the specifics of what happened, but he clearly did something that they weren't okay with. And it's my understanding they blindsided him in a hotel room and were battering him with the phone to the point where, not far off, not killing him, but it was a proper battering. And obviously that didn't do his hard man rep any good, even though there was two larger guys attacking him, blindsiding him. Doesn't, I think most people would go down to two larger guys blindsiding them.
That is nasty.
That is like, that's what he did there. That is clever. I never really liked the Nasty Boys, to be honest. They always looked a bit shit, really.
Yeah, I was the same.
Just sloppy, and I suppose part of their appeal in some way. They weren't like your traditional bodybuilders who looked almost like their wrestling was a choreographed dance. They looked like a couple of fat slobs in a brawl, which is what they were.
Oh, yeah.
So Steve Austin there has already made his entrance. Bret's on his way out now. So again, Bret returns, Survivor Series. The landscape is returned to as a lot more shades of grey. Anti-heroes like Steve Austin are being cheered. And the Royal Rumble in '97, held at the Alamo Dome in Texas, Bret eliminates Austin right near the end, but the referees don't see it. Austin slides back in and eliminates Vader, The Undertaker, and then Bret to seemingly win the Rumble. So he's announced as the winner at that particular point, but Bret and Vader and The Undertaker have a valid claim that they were cheated out of it because they were eliminated by someone who had already been eliminated.
Yeah.
On that same night, Shawn Michaels regains the world title from Sid, having lost it to him in the aforementioned Survivor Series. And they seem to be building for probably a Shawn Michaels-Bret Hart rematch at WrestleMania. Now, I've heard different views as to whether that was to be for the title or not. Either it was a title rematch, Austin's double leg Bret taking him down, the match is on, or if actually they were going to go for the Undertaker versus Sid title match that they ended up with in the end, just in a bit of a roundabout way. So that takes us to February. You've got Shawn as a champion. Shawn comes out on an episode of Raw, which is held on Thursday and is known as Thursday Raw Thursday. It's the one that we mentioned when you quizzed me a number of weeks ago, where Rocky Maivia beats Hunter Hearst Helmsley for his first Intercontinental title.
Yeah.
It's the same night that Shawn Michaels comes out and cuts his famous losing his smile speech, where he says he's got a serious knee injury and he basically needs to go home and recover. And as a relatively small part of the speech, he says that I think it was his mum had pointed out that he'd lost his smile and he needs to go home and find his smile, which the consensus is that that's him dodging out of doing the job to Bret at WrestleMania.
So why was this a submission match?
Good question. I'll come to that in a second, but I'm not 100% sure why, actually. I'm assuming it's because of, interferences and stuff like that to try and negate that slightly. I mean, it's a bit harsh on Steve, because whilst he did used to use the Texas Cloverleaf and call it the Hollywood Vine when he was in WCW, he doesn't have a regular submission move at this point.
That's why I thought it was a bit odd.
Yeah.
Obviously, his sharpshooter is quite famous, but
I'm presuming that they built it somehow in the storyline, but I can't particularly remember. They're brawling off into the crowd now. It's a powerful start to the match. So Shawn drops the title with tears in his eyes. The following Sunday's pay-per-view was due to be a four-way called Final Four between Bret, Austin, Undertaker, and Vader, seemingly at that point with the winner getting the title shot at WrestleMania. That then becomes for the vacant world title. Bret wins it. Last North American high-quality Vader match, from my understanding, having had an absolute series of stormers in WCW, but then a really disappointing WWF run. He puts in a shift there, bleeds heavily from above the eye, and it's considered his last good match in North America. But Bret wins the title, drops it the next night after Steve Austin's interference to Sid, bringing us back to Sid versus Undertaker for the title at Mania, the same night as this, and setting up Bret versus Austin. Now, I don't know what the original plan would have been for Austin, because in theory, you're looking at Bret and Shawn, whether it be the title or not, and you're looking at Sid and Taker. I don't know if Austin's then left with someone else from the Hart Foundation. if the Hart Foundation's even reformed at this point. It's not, has it? No, I'm not sure what Austin would have done. So thank goodness Sean lost his smile, because whilst the Bret versus Sean rematch would have been nice in some ways, what we got here was arguably better.
Yeah. I've got some questions for you then.
Go on, hit me up.
So I'm determined to beat you this time.
Oh, you spent ages looking at these, have you?
Well, I just thought, because sometimes I'll avoid certain questions because I think, well, no one knows that, but you proved me wrong on that. More trivial one. Do you know what Bret Hart's middle name is?
Sergeant?
Yes.
Yeah.
And what's Stone Cold's real name?
Steve Williams?
Oh, Steve Jensen.
Right, okay. So where's the Williams then? Because that's given as his real name. And in fact, actually, I've got Steve Austin's Wikipedia page right in front of me, and it says on here, born Stephen James Anderson. So where does the Jensen come in then?
I don't know.
There's no mention on his Wikipedia page of Jensen. So he was born Stephen James Anderson, later Stephen James Williams. Steve Williams, as I said. He adopted the name Steve Austin after there was already a Steve Williams, Dr. Death, in wrestling. And someone suggested he use the name Steve Austin, which up until that point was more well known as the $6 Million Man, if you remember.
Yeah.
I remember my dad, when I first mentioned Steve Austin, saying, what, $6 Million Man? And me not having any idea what he was talking about. So I'm not seeing the Steve Jensen bit. I think you just made that up.
I think I've wrote down
you know, to beat me in the quiz, there have to be actual answers to the questions. That's not how quizzes work.
What's written in front of me, John.
Yeah.
And per my piece of paper, you're wrong.
Well, fact, yeah. You beat me. You win. Okay, Austin and Bret brawling on the outside there. Ring post, ring steps have been knocked to one side. It's the old blue steps still, actually, at that point. They must have changed at some point in the next few years to the big silver ones that made more of a clang.
So then I think about this. I mean, knowing you've probably done this already anyway, but have you ever thought about, and I think you should seriously consider it, applying to go on Mastermind and having WWF as your specialist subject?
Maybe for certain limited years, and also, to be honest, it's embarrassing enough being a wrestling fan anyway, isn't it? Appearing on national TV as well probably isn't the forefront of my aims. I'm on the national radio this afternoon. That's a start.
What are you talking about? It's embarrassing being a wrestling fan.
No, I'm joking. I think realistically, I'd have to have well, I suppose if I gave certain years in WWF only, maybe. I'm not convinced. So I was just saying there about the change of the ring steps. I remember when they changed those big silver metal ring steps. I think that was the point when the announcers started ridiculously exaggerating the weight of them. Because any time someone held them above their head, they'd say they meant the weight. I seem to remember them saying 300. I don't know if that was pounds or kilos, but either way, from the ease in which they raised it over their heads, it was neither amount. Having just watched the World's Strongest Man final yesterday, 300 pounds overhead is the sort of stuff those guys do. Not with a struggle, but it's not just casually picking it up and lifting it overhead. Yeah. And they are big old boys. Yeah,
I was chuffed with Stoltman getting on the podium.
I didn't realise that Stoltman got him second, so I'd seen a flash of an image of the podium, and it was enough to know that first wasn't any of the British guys. And I remember he got a beard, and then when I started watching the semis and what have you, I thought it was probably Novikov.
Yeah,
and I was right with that. But when Stoltman then came second, I was surprised because I thought there was no Brits on the podium.
That was great.
Speaking of World's Strongest Man, actually, we were watching this yesterday, and, you know, in the final, Novikov broke the record from 1983 of the maximum deficit deadlift.
Yeah.
Originally set by Tom McGee. They showed you lifting blocks of cheese. Yeah. And I think we may have brought this up in previous episodes. He was a wrestler carried by Bret Hart in a famous carry job that made Vince McMahon think he was the next Hulk Hogan, only to realise that he was shit. And that actually, while he'd been watching that match and thinking he was looking at his future champion, he was looking at the wrong man. But we've covered that in previous episodes, but I was then reminded watching that of Tom McGee. Tom McGee's an amazing athlete. If you look at a guy that can lift 535 kilos from a deficit, but still can do it, and can do a gainer off the top row and land on his feet, There's not many, stroke anyone else that can do that.
Yeah, he's in a small crowd of men there, isn't he?
What was interesting though is looking yesterday while watching that World's Strongest Man final, I looked at Tom McGee's Wikipedia page, and his record just broken by Novikov for the deficit deadlift with a bending bar, 500 and whatever it was, 35 before. His actual deadlift, his record for that was something like 350, which is still amazing. But that's a long way off the current world record of 500.
Yeah, quite low for the World's Strongest Man, isn't it?
So I was surprised there was that much difference between what he could do on a normal deadlift. I suppose he is tall. That probably makes a difference.
It just shows where his weak point is, I guess.
Yeah. You would say to his face that he's weak, yeah?
Yeah, I'd say you need to work. I'd show him how to lift properly from the floor.
Okay. Even though he can already do 3 times what you can from the floor.
Not 3 times.
2.5? It's not 3 times, it's like 2.9. That'd be silly.
Right, which WWF Championship, or WWE, sorry, did Bret Hart not win?
European?
Oh, no.
He didn't win the European. Light heavyweight? Women's?
United States.
That wasn't in WWE when Bret was in WWE. Poor question. So he didn't win the European title. That was brought in just a month before this, February 97. He didn't win that. Light heavyweight title was brought in 97 as well. Now, Bret's too heavy for that, obviously. Women's title, obviously, he can't win. But the United States title was in WCW at this point. He did win the United States title whilst in WCW. So he has won the US title. It's impossible for him to win it in WWE. So that's another rubbish question. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just going back to where I picked the questions from. And
is it rubbishquestions.com?
No, the question's mine. It's the answer that I've written down that was wrong.
Right. Steve's brought a chair in. As usual, we're not really talking all about the match, but I do remember watching this at the time to being a quality match. This is a period where I'd tape them off Sky Sports and watch them. I'd stay up for some, to be honest. I think I may have stayed up for this one. I think I'd have stayed up for like the WrestleManias and the Survivor Series and all that. I'm not sure about some of the smaller pay-per-views. So go on.
So at this point now, then, 1997, how many pay-per-views are there?
They're into one a month at this point. So in 95 was when they started doing the more frequent ones. Up until 95, they'd got your big 5, as it was then. And then In Your House was the first of the monthly pay-per-views held in, I'd say about April, May 95, headlined by Diesel defending against Sid, if I remember correctly. Then you had King of the Ring the following month and In Your House 2, and they basically pretty much alternated between a big 5 pay-per-view and an In Your House. And then the In Your Houses started to get taglines. So it'd be like In Your House, It's Time, or In Your House, Degeneration X, or what have you. And then a little while later, probably maybe 98, something like that, they dropped the In Your House bit and it just became the name of the pay-per-view. The In Your House pay-per-views were mini pay-per-views. They were offered instead of at $24.95, they were offered at $14.95 and were more like 2 hours long. And in the first one, hence the name of the show, you could win a house.
Wow.
Yeah, some sort of live draw on the night where someone won a house. But yeah, they're into regular monthly pay-per-views at this point. This is really the start of the big ascendancy of Steve Austin. So people often retcon that after King of the Ring 96, when he won the King of the Ring and cut the incendiary promo against Jake Roberts and mentioned Austin 316 and what have you, that was then him, off to the races at that point. But actually, he had a rematch with Mark Merrow at the next month's In Your House. SummerSlam 96, he was in a dark match, or free-for-all, I suppose it was, against Yokozuna. Didn't do much then until Bret arrives on the scene at Survivors 96, and it's really around this time when he really starts to get a big following, and then more and more popular throughout 97 until in 98 he's made the man, so to speak.
Do you know how many WWE championships he held?
Austin, world titles, 6.
Yeah.
Bret held 5. Hogan 5 at this point, but came back for a 6-1 in 2002. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the record, because obviously at the moment John Cena's tied with Ric Flair's slightly fictional record of 16, and you assume he was going to be the one to break it, but it's been now, 4 years since he had a world title, and it was a few years before that. Randy Orton's only a couple off now. I think he's on 14. So it wouldn't surprise me if actually Orton's the one to break the record, or even if they get Orton up to 16, and then in a couple of years' time, it could be Cena's retirement match, Orton versus Cena for a vacant title, and the winner breaks the record, something like that.
Yeah, Orton isn't going anywhere soon, is he?
You'd think not, but I mean, he is 40 years old, so whilst you think he's got several years in him, he's not got a decade, you wouldn't think. You know, most, even like Triple H, who's in his 50s now, he had that one title to do the main event against Roman Reigns a few years ago. But other than that, it'd been a number of years since he'd had it. He's probably only won it once in the last decade, something like that.
Yeah.
You know, once he turned 40 onwards. So, you know, Orton's he needs 3 more title reigns to break the record. But we shall see. It might be Charlotte Flair that breaks the record, takes her old man's record from him. Interestingly, though, there is an argument that Ric Flair's world title reign should be more like 20 to 25, because there's a number that he says where he just lost and then regained the title on like a loop. So they were touring wherever, Australia, and he lost it to a local guy and won it back on the last day of the tour. There's a few particular ones. I think there's one in Puerto Rico and one somewhere else where he chose to drop the title mid-match because he was concerned there was going to be a mass riot. It was against their local hero, and he basically allowed local hero to pin him for the title, and then they just pretended it never happened. So you could make an argument that he lost it and then maybe regained it. But 16...
Yeah, Pele.
Yeah. Right, so the brawl on the outside. Still, there's not been all that much action on the inside of the ring so far. I think Austin just been bust open, hasn't he? Because the famous finish for this match, which I'm sure you know anyway, is Austin essentially passing out through blood loss and pain to the sharpshooter. So they've got him now busted open with the ring bell, it must be, because that's now on the apron. Shamrock's looking a bit useless there. He doesn't really look like he knows what he's doing, does he?
He's not serving much of a purpose, is he?
He's just like occasionally looking at them or pointing at them, but doesn't really seem to be getting all that involved. Having said that, though, this is a big step up to the previous WrestleMania submission match, which was Bret Hart against Bob Backlund at WrestleMania 11 2 years prior, which just had Roddy Piper sticking, as the guest referee, sticking a microphone in Bret or Bob Backlund's face going, "What do you say?"
Yeah, I've seen that one.
20 seconds. And no offence to Bob Backlund, but Steve Austin's opponent's a step up. Bob Backlund, to me, is an interesting one, because in 92, when he comes back, he is portrayed as being an old man, a relic from a dim and distant past. And at that point, he's got to be 40 at most, and he's only been gone 8 years, something like that. Whereas, Edge just came back after a 9-year hiatus, well into his 40s, 46, something like that. Triple H is well into his 50s now, and is whilst he's clearly not a full-timer, he's very much pitched as being competitive and able to hang with the boys rather than being an old man. Even Ric Flair, well into his mid to late 50s. I know he wasn't world title level, but he wasn't pitched as being completely past it, was he?
Well, I was never a fan of Bob Backlund. He never interested me at all.
I don't think he interested anyone, did he?
I don't know, because I always get the impression that he's regarded as a bit of a legend, but I just found everything about him incredibly boring.
I think he had this all-American boy persona. I think WWF would always like to have a babyface champion defending against large heels. And I think after the lengthy reigns from Bruno Sammartino in the 60s and 70s, they wanted someone a bit different to that, not sort of your ethnic character that Bruno and Pedro Morales had been. And Vince Sr., for whatever reason, decided Bob Backlund was the man for that. And I think at the time, opinion on him was somewhat mixed. Whilst he was popular and obviously over enough to hold the title for about 6 years, I think there was a large element of the New York audience that didn't like him even back in the early 80s. He was pitched, actually, Bob Backlund, having dropped the title to transitionary champion, the Iron Sheik, who then dropped it to Hogan for the start of Hulkamania. It was pitched to Backlund that he'd turn heel, dye his hair blonde, cut it short, and feud with Hogan. But he turned it down. Mainly, my understanding is because he didn't want I think it was just his daughter or possibly his kids, to have people say mean things at school about their dad.
Oh, wow.
Bless him. I think he didn't massively approve of the new direction of wrestling at that point. But yeah, when he came back, he was clearly an old man, even though he was younger. I mean, even at this point, Bret here is 39. He turns 40 later this year. So at this point, he's a similar age to Backlund at the start of his past it old man stage.
I've said this to you before. I've still never seen a better wrestler at taking corner bumps than Bret Hart.
Yeah, chest first, yeah. But I agree.
I know that you don't really like it because it's kind of every match he's involved in.
Yeah, it's one of those, again, that it's like when people fall into or go into certain positions that they don't normally go in to enable their opponent's moves to work. Steve Austin never whips anyone else chest first into the buckle. So in theory, there's something different about the way he whips them to make it happen chest first. But why is it Bret's opponents always do that against him and not against anyone else?
Again, though, I think there's an element sometimes of you looking at that with your wrestling brain rather than I just like seeing Bret Hart being slung into a corner.
And out of all of them as well, it's far lesser than some of them. Like I never liked Triple H's one where he, gets thrown high into the corner and flips over, lands to the floor. I was never keen on Flair's one where he sort of rolls up and over. Although at least I suppose he's going for an offensive move. But anyway,
the worst Ric Flair one is the fall where
I never got that at all.
No, even as a kid, I used to know me. John, which Triple Crown champion was Bret Hart? First, second, third, or fourth?
So Triple Crown, you're thinking tag, intercontinental, and world. So Pedro Morales, who I just mentioned before, was the first one.
That's going to be your bonus point.
Bonus point already. Second one, all three belts. I'm going to go Bret second.
Correct.
Yeah, good stuff. Yeah, because he'd have got there in '92, having won the world title. Pedro Morales actually did it the opposite way around. He won the world title first, then possibly tag and then intercontinental, I think. Of course, now there's been, I don't know how many, 20, 30, 40 Triple Crown champions, something like that.
Yeah.
Right, Bret's putting Steve in the sharpshooter now, having tried it a few times before. I think this is possibly now building up to the end. It's a great visual, that, especially when he starts trying to sort of push up out of the sharpshooter, the blood dripping out of his face. Out of all the visuals, that's one that's stuck. I think 24 years later now, and is still occasionally played on stuff. I suppose nowadays it's always shown in black and white because of the blood loss. Bret had been, prior to this, the master of the secretive blade. So several times on pay-per-view, Bret bladed when he wasn't supposed to and got away with it because he did it so well that no one realised he bladed.
Wow.
So in your house in late '95, defending against the Bulldog, he blades then as he's being propelled headfirst into the steps, and it looks like it was the steps. I think it was his match possibly against Roddy Piper, WrestleMania 8. I think he bladed then.
Yeah.
Got away with it because it was seen to be accidental, whereas I think Flair blades in the main event have been told not to and gets fined for it because it was so obvious.
It was always quite fitting with, not fitting, but it always looked good with when Flair bladed because of his blonde hair.
It did, yeah. One of the best blade jobs I've ever seen is also from 1997. It's also in a 5-star match. It's The Undertaker versus Shawn Michaels' original Hell in a Cell. Michaels blades, he's on the outside of the cell. He goes to drop kick Taker, hits it once, goes for the second one. Taker grabs his legs and catapults him into the cell on the outside. You can just see out the corner of the screen. You can't tell he's blading as such, but you can see a movement of his hand. He blades while he's held upside down in the catapult position.
Wow.
So, there we go. Match has ended. Shamrock's called it off. So he blades. So by the time he hits the cell and bounces off, he's bleeding, which is what would have happened if he'd banged his head on there. You rewind 2 seconds, he's not bleeding there. It looks pretty legit. And I think I only know he bladed there because I'd read it somewhere and went back and watched it. It's amazing timing that. He must have taken out of his waistband or taking it from the referee before hitting the second drop kick or possibly the first. And then literally you've got half a second, maybe 1 second while you're upside down about to be catapulted, a quick scratch across the head and you're done.
Yeah, brilliant. One
of the most famous accidental blades ever was Kerry Von Erich, the Texas Tornado as was in WWF. A few years prior, he had a bit of a drug problem, Kerry Von Erich, and he's about to go out for a match, clearly off his head. And I think if I get this right, he's got a blade taped into his wrist and he's about to go out for a first blood match. And he just scratches his head and accidentally cuts his head open. And then walks out for this first blood match. I think it was a first blood match. That might be wrong. So they had to send someone to immediately jump him at the start of the match to explain why he's bleeding.
Oh, brilliant. That's something I'd do. Oh, shit.
Okay. So Bret's continuing to work over Austin's leg. And I think more than the match, actually, it's this bit here at the end which solidifies what is probably the most famous double turn. Going into this, Bret is clearly the babyface, Austin clearly the heel. Shamrock's just giving him a waistlock takedown, squaring up to him. And I think it was Austin's never say die attitude, and then Bret's post-match attack and Austin's, what do you call it, resilience here that solidifies the double turn. You then get an absolute corker for the rest of 1997. Originally, at one point, when we were looking at the match listings for this show, we'd got in that we were going to have the main event of the In Your House Canadian Stampede from July, until we realised it had both Bret and Austin in as well, and Shamrock, funnily enough. All through the rest of this year, you've got some variation of Bret and the Hart Foundation versus Austin and Michaels and this whole Canada versus America, really almost America versus the rest of the world. Bret and the Hart Foundation are essentially playing faces to the rest of the world, but heels to America.
Yeah.
It was really well done. I remember at the time being a big difference to the previous very black and white, good guy, bad guy storylines you had up until that point. Oh, there we go. Austin stunning a ref as he was. I don't know if he'd really done much ref stunning at that point, but he spent the rest of 97 and into 98 stunning pretty much anyone he could get the hang of. Quiz question for you. Who invented the stunner?
Yeah, you've asked me this before. Is it someone ridiculous?
Yes and no. I mean, if you only know them by the way you might know them from the modern game, it's a bit random. But if you understand that they had a career as a wrestler before that, it's John Laurinaitis. So he's been a character on TV, but not for the last few years. He was head of creative, or I forget what it was, in WWE, and worked backstage at WCW before being brought over when they were brought out. But prior to that, he was a wrestler, Johnny Ace, who wrestled a little bit in WCW as part of the Dynamic Dudes with Shane Douglas, but most famously in All Japan Pro Wrestling. So if you wrestle in All Japan, you're a pretty good wrestler, to be honest. Yeah. And he created what he called the Ace Crusher, which I think was a little bit more like an RKO diamond cutter type move. It involved him going flat on his back, opponent coming chin down on his shoulder.
Okay.
And then by the time that Austin starts doing it here, I think Diamond Dallas Page in WCW would have been using the diamond cutter, which is probably the closest to the RKO. It's a full flat one. And then Austin started using the stunner here. But prior to Austin, if I remember correctly, the first person to do a stunner in WWF was Hunter Hearst Helmsley. For a couple of weeks before he adopted the pedigree, he did what essentially was a not very good stunner for his finish on episodes of Superstars or whatever it was back then.
Wow.
You got any more quiz questions for me?
At which event did Stone Cold defeat Owen Hart to end their feud?
To completely end their feud would be the Survivor Series 97. So he beat him at SummerSlam in 97, despite having just received a sit-out tombstone that temporarily paralysed him, winning his first Intercontinental title, but then had to vacate it due to that neck injury. Owen wins a tournament to regain it and then loses it back to Austin. And then drops to Austin, then abandons it and gives it to young Rocky Maivia, which I think we've covered again in the previous episode.
And how many times did Austin hold the Intercontinental Championship?
Just those two, I think. Those 2 times in '97. I don't think he ever came back to it afterwards.
Correct.
Oh, yeah.
One more Bret Hart question for you.
Go on.
One sec. Which years did Bret Hart win King of the Ring?
93 for the official televised one, and 91 for an untelevised one.
Sake.
So, discounting your either bad questions or bad answers, is that full marks, yeah?
Yeah, full marks.
Boom. You've got one more week to try and catch me out. Next week, we've got the main event for the, whichever, this linear, the World Heavyweight title. It's, which round is it? It's Cena defended against Punk for Money in the Bank 2011. And that will be the end of Series 1 of the greatest wrestling show ever. Now, we had an idea for Series 2, which I want to see if you're still thinking we might do this, and that was to have essentially an elimination-style tournament. So to pick out, let's say 16 top wrestlers, because then there'd be 8 first-round matches, 4, 2, and 1. And I think originally we'd suggested maybe like a random draw, but the danger with that is you just get people who have never wrestled each other. You put them back in the draw, and then you end up with the last 2 or 3 matches just people who've never wrestled each other. So what I thought I could do is knock up an Excel spreadsheet, because you know I like them. Who has wrestled who, not necessarily on a particularly famous match or whatever, but just what options we've got. And I'm sure I can figure out a way to sort it to let us know which combination of matches we could do. But some of them might just be completely random matches. It could be, for example, Kane and Sting, because Kane, in his pre-Kane days, wrestled Sting on a random episode of WCW Saturday Night in like 1994. It could be a random match from some tiny promotion, 10, 15 years after they were famous, but that might be interesting as a next step to what we've done so far.
Sounds good.
Okay, well, we'll do that. We'll do the final next week, and then we may go straight into it. We may have a little rest, but we'll have a look at that. I think we'll do similar to what we did with this series, where we have an episode 1, which essentially is picking the 16 wrestlers, deciding which ones we think should be and shouldn't. Maybe with that as well, we've got a few considerations. Do we make it across all companies? Do we not include as readily those that we've already seen matches for? So, whilst you could argue that they should be in the top 16, do we say, well, we've already seen a Steve Austin or Hulk Hogan match? But that's food for thought for the next series anyway.
As long as Matt Hardy's in there, I'm not.
That's the main thing. Yeah. How many different gimmicks has Matt Hardy worked under? Could we make it so an entire tournament is just Matt Hardy versus someone? But then you can't make this. He'd have to lose all but one of them, wouldn't he? Because you can't make the second round Matt Hardy versus Matt Hardy.
Series 3, maybe.
I tell you what we could do. What would be the lamest series we could ever do is people essentially wrestling themselves. You've had an Undertaker versus Undertaker match. You've had a Kane versus Kane match. I'm not sure what else, but I'm sure there's a few others for the years we can make a really shit tournament out of.
Yeah, definitely. Well, sounds excellent.
All right, awesome, guys. Hope you enjoyed that, and we'll see you next week.